So welcome everybody to the Science and Data Subcommittee, the Vermont Climate Council meeting for July 21st. I am TJ Poor, a co-chair of the subcommittee along with Jared Duval. Today's agenda is mainly focused on the social cost of carbon. We'll get an introduction and discussion of that from David Hill from Energy Futures Group, and then take some time to complete a survey associated with that. We'll also have some updates from the task leads, and those are the main agenda items, and end a little bit early after public comment and talking about next steps, next meetings. Does anybody have any comments on the agenda? Before we get into task lead updates, I would I'd just like to note that the minutes of from our last meeting 2 weeks ago were posted. Thank you, Claire, for taking those notes. Does anybody have any comments or objections on the minutes from July 7th? Hearing none, we'll consider those approved. Thank you. We'll go right into, I feel like we're all business today here. Jump right into the next agenda item, which are task lead updates. I'll note that social cost of carbon is going to be the main discussion of today's meeting, so maybe we won't talk about that item. But going down the list I have in my mind, the first one is the greenhouse gas inventory group, and instead of asking Jared or Richard about updates, I may just David put you on the spot and start with an update of where you are on the greenhouse gas inventory report.
Sure. Thank you. We are working on the content for the draft of the greenhouse gas inventory report. We've had some good discussions, several good discussions with Colin Smythe at A&R. We've talked about both the development of kind of a summary table that talks about the different methods that are used in the current inventory to help folks at a very high level understand by sector. These are the primary methods and data that are used by sector. And then also following the IPCC guidance, may do a bit of a what's called a key category analysis to help document that Vermont is kind of the key categories of emissions for Vermont are being accounted for in the current inventory, and ways to keep track looking forward of any trends and changes. So a key category analysis we're trying to include in that. We've gotten good review materials from California, New York, and Massachusetts inventories. Liz Bourget, who's on the phone with us today, is also looking at the consumption-based emissions inventory methodologies and literature review based on the work done in Oregon and Minnesota. And so we are busy working on that report. And in terms of, I think probably what we would be aiming to do at this point is to have a draft for review by the end of this month, then with a relatively short period for comments and review questions and things like that following, and then finalize based on that.
So is it fair to, oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut the line, Richard. I see your hand is up.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to quickly ask David, so then is it fair to say that we likely wouldn't, the earliest at which we would have a review, a draft for kind of discussion with the full subcommittee would be the August 4th meeting, but certainly wouldn't be looking to plan it into the next Wednesday's meeting, although perhaps being ready for a draft for review towards the end of next week that we could turn around as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
David, I appreciate the organized way that you're approaching this. My only question for you right this minute is whether you have seen a couple of different documents that I shared with this subcommittee over the past several months, identifying areas of concern and a set of recommendations that I had made.
I do have the materials. I think you sent them to me, Richard, after one of the discussions, so thank you. There was the document that had the Levasseur, kind of the estimate of the Hydro-Quebec emissions concerning the inundation and the upstream estimates of those. And I think what we'll be able to do is compare and contrast and give context for different elements of those. I would say generally that the accounting and the methods that have been used for the accounting in Vermont, I think, are pretty consistent with what other states are doing. The upstream emissions are important to consider in an upstream quote life cycle emissions are important to consider in mitigation pathways, but they get very confusing when we've discussed a little bit before when you actually try to incorporate them into the accounting because of needing to account for those should be, and following the IPCC guidelines and other things, those accounting of the upstream emissions should be accounted for where they're happening. So, but yes, we do have the materials that you've sent, and we are along with the other items that were kind of identified in our scope of work that we're meant to address in the report, we will be referencing them as well.
I can't tell for sure from what you said whether there's one particular document that I wrote that I will resend you just in case.
Okay, I think I do. There was a letter that was comments on the inventory. Yes, so I think we have it. But if you resend it, that's always helpful because yes, always helpful and welcome.
Just as a general comment, although I respect decisions that people made elsewhere for various reasons,
Yeah.
I don't think that those should be dispositive for us necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
just one last comment. The accounting for us is made somewhat simpler than it would be for other states, because as far as I know, we don't export any energy or the raw materials for energy. That is, we're not a gas producing state or a petroleum-based products producing state. We no longer produce nuclear electricity, and I don't think we produce enough hydro to export. So it makes the process thinking about boundaries simpler than if we were also an exporter.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, David, for that update, and Richard for the question. And I'll just also note generally that the public comments that we've received have been passed along and to David and the EFG team as well. So it's my understanding that everything that's been submitted through both the portal and directly to either Jane or myself or Jared have been passed along.
Thanks.
Great. So going down the list, I think the next task lead update is surrounds the LEAP modeling, and I'll just give a brief update as to where that is at. With the SEI has made a number of revisions to the business as usual case, taking into account some of the great feedback we heard here and at the cross-sector mitigation committee and elsewhere. In particular, the electric vehicle forecast. It was probably the biggest adjustment that we were probably assuming too much penetration in the business as usual forecast, given uncertainty over funding for incentives. But there were other changes as well. And, you know, they provided an internal pathway that aligned where it could, with EAN pathways model to kind of show the increment from business as usual to meeting mitigation pathways. That's still under some internal review, and but you know, at the first opportunity when we think it's ready to go, we will share that and provide it to the subcommittees for further comment. And the process going forward for other pathways is to develop at least one that's consistent with the pathways and actions that are being developed in the cross-sector mitigation committee, and to see where those recommendations would get us. And then also some others that the department had in its contract for you know, testing for in-state and out-of-state generation, putting constraints on the model to see what happens when we say we must have X% come from in-state or out-of-state. And then once those several pathways are developed, then the Climate Council and EFG and the Cadmus will be contracting separately with SEI to do any additional runs that may be warranted from the council. So I think that is the process. I think in upcoming weeks we will have another presentation for this committee and cross sector if they want it. And then the next step for that task group is also to start to incorporate the economic analysis, and that's EFG and Cadmus are doing that, and coordinating with SEI on kind of the outputs from the LEAP model to understand the economic impacts, not only monetarily, but also some co-benefits as well. And they're, you know, we're talking mid-August now, late August, but there will be further process and iteration with the task group, I expect, on kind of those kinds of assumptions. Jared, you're on mute if you're.
Thanks. And if it's okay, just before we move on from this task group, it's not directly connected to the LEAP modeling, but it's kind of parallel and relevant to. I'll just note, some of you may see that May B is on the meeting. That's May Butler, EAN's data manager, and I just wanted to make sure to let everybody know that May will be giving a presentation and hosting a discussion about the EAN emissions reduction pathways analysis on Tuesday, August 3rd from noon to 1. So I'm going to just put that in the chat, and there's a registration link there for anybody who is interested.
Thanks, Jared. So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the next up on the task list group is the cross-cutting, cross-sector task group. And Leslie Ann, you popped on my screen. It's nice to see you.
I have a habit of doing that, right? Just popping in and popping out. Oh, goodness. All right. So I have 4 things to report on, and they are both from the cross-cutting group, but also from the data gaps and needs and monitoring piece. So the first one is there was the the Chicago Climate Action Plan, which was released last Tuesday. And folks on both the subcommittee as well as on the council have that link. And as soon as I finish chatting here, I will put that link in the chat so that everybody has that access. And it was designed by Dr. Ned Gardner, who is in the climate program office and working with trying to get not just the regional level, but also up to the international level to bring these climate action plans together. So when I put the link in the chat, you'll see what the document looks like. And I'm going to have you take a look at pages 68 to 72, which are where a lot of the climate information that is being prepared for our climate council would look very, very similar to that. Dr. Gardner actually worked with my climatology class a few years ago. Neil Kammen's son was in that class, and we were working with the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is what the Chicago Climate Action Plan is based on. So there's a nice little sort of Vermont connection already taking place there. And he's offered, if we're willing, to take a look at the framing of our plan as it stands right now, and to share some of the templates and the spreadsheets that were used in the Chicago Climate Action Plan, if they would be of assistance to us. So I'm just offering that out there because we don't have to start from scratch, right? And coincidentally, he's also going to be in Vermont in August. So if there's any way that anybody wants to meet with him, we could probably try and set up, again, maybe an in-person or a face-to-face type meeting around that. So that's the first piece. The second piece is I had a chance to chat with Jared Ulmer about 10 days ago, and we were looking and sort of going into depth in terms of some of the things that he and Richard were talking about last time we met, with the pros and cons of various types of heating and other elements in there, the pros and cons of EVs and electrification, and the sort of air quality implications that we don't always think about because EVs are heavier and they have more wear and tear on the road. And then that might bring in some pieces that we need to sort of look at as we are moving down that path. And I'm going to put a pin in right here for Andrea Wright at VTrans, because this might be a nice way of cutting across some of those conversations in looking at strategies and ways in which some of our existing talent can actually be brought to bear. And Jared also mentioned weatherization, which I know we're thinking of as a mitigative strategy. It could also be a strategy for adaptation. And so again, these are some of the pieces that we can think about holistically as we move forward in the sort of win-win-win context. So the third thing I wanted to report back on is last week, we had a great discussion among Claire, Bennett, John, Andrea, Brian, and myself. And we're pooling together our expertise, our knowledge bases, where we sit in our various agencies and how that could help elevate and support the work of both this subcommittee as well as the council in general. And a couple of the things that are coming out of that, we only had one meeting, but a couple of things that are coming out of that are to maybe revisit that do no harm diagram that I had shown about a month ago, and really sort of flesh out what the unifying framework is and what the common terminology pieces are for us as an entire committee and council to bring to bear to the actual writing of the plan itself. We also talked a little bit about the ways in which our approaches as a subcommittee could tie in or feed back with a lot of the public engagement that's taking place, and ways to support public buy-in. And there was an interesting concept that Andrea brought up around human-centered design, which we're going to explore a little bit more as we use some of that to help up with, again, with the framing and the writing, especially of the front pieces of the plan itself. And then the last thing from our meeting last week was John was particularly interested in data provenance and data governance. Where do we already have data that exist? What needs to be collected still? The quality of those data, what are the gaps? And then how do we use all of those answers to help us set up our monitoring and evaluation strategies? And the last piece is I'd be interested in chatting with Bennett offline, especially around air quality issues, because air quality is something that is regulated within the state and is not reported by EPA. And so when we think about bringing some of the air quality pieces to the table, having that sort of three-way conversation with Jared Elma and Bennett Leon would be really, really interesting to sort of tease that out. So my fourth and final piece that I wanted to report on is I had a conversation with Mike Colleon at EPA last week, and Mike is in charge of all of the climate change indicators that are being generated for states for the entire US. And he's going to be sending me information on things like Lyme disease and heat-related death. And he also gave me a heads up that there are some vulnerability indices that are going to be available down to the census tract level, and those are going to be available in September. So with that, I'm going to close off and start filling the chat with all of these links that I just promised you.
Great, thank you, Leslie Ann. You have been busy. Any comments or questions from folks for Leslie Ann and our crew?
Hi, thank you so much for that. This is Kashka. Can I possibly have Dr. Gardner's email if possible? In the chat as well?
I will try and get it to you if you pop your email in the chat or just send me an email.
Great, thank you so much.
Not a problem.
I guess I'll chime in on the Chicago plan, and Leslie Ann, I'm interested in learning more about that, and obviously learning from other examples as to not recreate the process and be informed by what other jurisdictions are doing. I will just, as a interest for you and others, perhaps I sit on a director level monthly meeting call right now with other states that have climate laws similar to ours, and we do a very similar sort of conversation about like reflecting on what other states have done for climate action plans and trying to share templates and examples. And it'd be interesting and I wonder if you are thinking about it from the broadest level of like learning from Chicago, or if there's some specific takeaways that you've gleaned from this specific plan that should be of particular interest for us in this case. And so that I'm mostly interested in the specifics of if you've learned like anything that's done exceptionally well in that one, and how we might facilitate a conversation around that component, and then pulling the right people into that.
And so Jane's awesome question. I think the answer is both. I think it's the overarching framing as well as the individual pieces. And I think the thing that really stuck out to me when I first saw it, it's aesthetically pleasing, extremely aesthetically pleasing, which is very, very important in terms of science communication. So that there's that piece. But it also does a really nice job of weaving vulnerability and why are we doing this all the way through, right? And so when we talk about mitigation strategies, we know why we're doing them. When we talk about adaptation, we know why we're doing it. And they're perfectly balanced, lengthwise as well as content-wise. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. And I submitted a question to the chat last week. I'm like, what are your 3 biggest takeaways from this? Because I had the same question as you, right? What have we learned from this process that is going to help us so that we don't have to go back and start from scratch? So yeah, happy to share.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Leslie Ann. And I think you covered a couple of categories there, both the cross-cutting systems and then the data gaps monitoring assessment strategy. So I guess I'm going to open to the subcommittee members if there are any other task updates or updates on other committees from liaisons that anybody wants to share.
I'm a little slow in the uptake here, but I have a question for Leslie Ann, or maybe for you, I don't know. If we think about let me get my picture on the screen. If we think about the health impacts of our interventions, of our climate mitigation interventions. How does that enter into the production of the plan? And to what extent would it ever be the case that the health benefits would be negative, that would be health harms, and we wouldn't adopt an intervention because of that? Or are there times when the health benefits of one alternative are so much bigger than the health benefits of a different alternative that it would push us into choosing the one with the greater health benefits? I mean, how do we factor that? You know, our charge is to reduce greenhouse gases. That's what we're supposed to do. But different paths are going to have slightly different health impacts. How do we factor that in?
Richard, that is a great point, and I don't have an answer to that right now because I don't think we have had that discussion yet.
Well, yeah,
So,
exactly. I'm trying to raise that.
right, and so I think it's a critically important question, and it's not that I'm punting it down the road, but I don't have like an actual answer right now because I think that's where talking more with Jared Ulmer would be critically important. Like I only had a half an hour conversation with him, and so I think getting all of the folks who have that interest expertise in the room to actually have that conversation is the first step. So you and Jared have had a conversation. Jared and I have had a conversation. We haven't had one as a group, and so I think that's a first step.
But I'm actually asking a somewhat different question. The question is not what are the health impacts of various interventions? The question is how do we take account of any health impacts in the decision making about what goes into the plan? Do you understand the distinction?
No, I'm not sure if I fully do. So I'm not sure if it's a sort of writing question that you're posing, sort of awareness question that you're posing, or a recommendation question.
It's a policy question.
So it's a recommendation question then.
Yeah. So, you know, if we have a choice between path A and path B for reducing vehicular emissions, for example, and the two paths differ in their health impacts, how do we account for the difference in health impacts in making the decision between path A and path B?
So,
You know, maybe this is for the cross-cutting committee to decide. It's not this committee's bailiwick, but so far we aren't articulated with that kind of policy making process.
so I can answer this, or maybe not answer, but provide some comment on this. And keep in mind, my perspective on this question anyway is going to be informed by the work we're doing on the comprehensive energy plan also.
Sure.
So where I see it coming in is in the analysis of those trade-offs. So in the comprehensive energy plan, we're trying to articulate what are the different trade-offs between policies and how do we evaluate those? What is the policy decision-making framework that we apply to all of our options, and how do we choose? The health impacts, I think, need to be articulated and you know, quantified where possible, and that's a qualifier there, where possible, because that's really hard to do, especially in a short time frame. And where not possible, we need to qualitatively address them so that we can kind of transparently say, yes, we have policy, like just like you presented, we have policy A and B, and policy, they have identical economic impacts, but then when you layer on the health impacts, one may become a clear winner or loser, depending on you know, what the choice is. And you know, part of that, how does it actually come to fruition in the climate action plan, I think is a little to be determined. I could see a scenario where climate action plan is going to recommend, here's how we get to our greenhouse gas goals. And then some of those actions are going to need legislative action. Some of them are policy action that can be done without the legislature. But ultimately, especially once we get past this kind of ARPA funding that's available, federal stimulus funding that's available, we're going to be making decisions using with limited public resources. Vermonters' pockets are not bottomless, and so I think that the health impacts, our job is to articulate and quantify and qualitatively discuss what the impacts are to inform those kinds of recommendations and decisions. And so I don't know, that's just my perspective. I don't know if that's the whole committee's perspective or everybody's, but hopefully that is helpful.
Yep, it is. I was trying to think of a concrete example, and it's a little hard to do in a vacuum. But let's suppose that one policy focuses on reducing vehicle miles traveled, and another policy focuses on increasing the efficiency of vehicles so that they produce fewer greenhouse gases per mile traveled. Those are both useful for reducing greenhouse gases, but they would have different impacts on the particulate and other pollution from vehicles.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what we need to try and raise and make transparent.
Yeah. At the very least, we can have a footnote that says we know this is an issue and we haven't solved it yet.
And
hopefully go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say, and just a reminder, one of my hopes on this question is that, in the scope of work for the consulting work that Cadmus and EFG are doing is not just economic modeling, but modeling of the health implications of some of the pathways. So I see that as being connected to the LEAP modeling and pathways modeling exercises as we're able to do kind of next level out analysis of, okay, once we have pathways, once we have strategies and actions, what type of analysis, what might we have to know some of the economic and health implications of those? But I think it's a great question, but I agree with everybody that it's more to come, but that we're not there yet.
And I know that I'm not always perfectly clear, and so I just want to say something again, maybe in a slightly different way, which is that my focus is on the health impacts of the policy choices we make for reducing greenhouse gases. This is not about preventing heat deaths from global warming. Okay, this is about the more local effects.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that discussion. Richard and Leslie Ann, that was a lot of good information. Recognizing, however, that we are now behind on our agenda. So I would, without any further ado, like to turn it over to David Hill to discuss the social cost of carbon.
Sorry, I was still on mute. Thank you, TJ. Is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you everybody for providing us with some time on the agenda today. This will take a kind of a different dimension approach to some questions that are in our scope of work that are important to address and that we really value inputs from the data and science subcommittee members, yourselves, on a polling exercise that will ask you to make some kind of state some preferences for different positions on how the future impacts from what Richard was saying he's not focused on right now, but from the greenhouse gas impacts themselves. If they're off in the future, if they're 30 years in the future, how should those be valued versus costs and benefits today? So the combined economic, health, damages, environmental, if we value things in using some fashion and you say, well, there's a future value, what are the ways in which the Data and Science Subcommittee address that in terms of intergenerational equity and the issues of what impacts today are valued compared to how they would be valued in the future. And this is directly related to the social cost of carbon and the discount rates that are used. And the social cost of carbon, I'll provide a little background here, but it's very sensitive to a discount rate. So the exercise we're going to take you through today will inform our initial report, and then we also will use this to inform polling for the entire Climate Council after our initial report. So a little bit further in the future here. Let me see if I can, why is this not advancing? Sorry. Got two screens and I'm not sure where the, so I'm going to go over just the objectives for today, a little bit of background on the social cost of carbon and on discount rates. Liz Bourget, who is also with EFG and is on the phone today with us. Both Liz and I work for Energy Futures Group. Energy Futures Group is part of the Cadmus team that has been selected to provide technical consultant report to the Vermont Climate Council. So we'll run through this polling exercise. Liz will paste a link to an online poll, and we would like to guide everyone through that and actually have you all complete that poll while we're on the phone today. And then we'll talk about the, we'll wrap up and we'll talk about next steps about how this information will be used. So the objectives, really, why are we talking about the social cost of carbon and a discount rate? The economic analysis of the costs and benefits of greenhouse gas emissions and abatement inform the climate action plan. And to have an economic analysis of the costs and benefits of greenhouse gas emissions, we need to think about a discount rate that will be used in determining the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon has been used by the federal government starting back now over a decade, and for other states for policy and climate action planning. It's if you would, it's not the same as a carbon tax. It's not a specific fee on carbon, but it is meant to estimate the value of an avoided unit, usually a metric ton or a ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases in the future, currently or in the future. And once again, because these have, some of the modeling goes out over long periods of time and there are long-lived impacts, and investments today can be avoiding emissions for some time in the future. These are highly sensitive to a discount rate that's chosen for the analysis. And there's no, there are different perspectives. Many people have a different, a specific viewpoint on whether a social cost of, a social discount rate. And when I say social discount rate, this puts a higher value on future impacts. And a private discount rate might be more that a household or an individual business firm would put higher value on near-term impacts, considering near-term budget or cash flow issues, those types of things. hold on just for 1 second. So today we'll present some statements and positions that reflect kind of more of a social discount rate perspective, and then some statements and perspectives that represent more of a private discount rate perspective. So we're going to present both. We're not saying one is better than the other. We're not just going to present one or the other. And we'd like to ask for your feedback, how strongly you agree or disagree with those statements in a poll. And then in a form of a very light form of deliberative polling, where we ask some questions and then we provide a little bit more information, we will provide a set of values drawn from recent New York State Department of Environmental Conservation assessment that was done for them by Resources for the Future, that used 3 different integrated assessment models, looking at the results, the mean results of multiple hundreds of runs of those models over the period 2300 out to 2300, and the resulting social cost of carbon for carbon dioxide based on those model runs. And so we'll present a table and again ask for your preferences about what you think the most from those, which are the most value, which discount rate. Will show the sensitivity of those results, of the social cost of carbon values and their sensitivity to discount rates. And we'll ask for your feedback on the poll at that point as well. So a little more background. There are 2 primary methods for the social cost of carbon estimation. Damage-based estimates, looking at most typically global damages and trying to capture economic, health, infrastructure, and environmental impact. So really a comprehensive view of what are the damages associated with 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions. This is, as you might imagine, very complicated. Yep.
Stop.
Excuse me, is there someone speaking?
I think
Okay.
that might have been an accident. Go ahead.
That's okay.
David.
That's okay. There's an extensive literature. There are many what are called integrated assessment models, which are a combination of geophysical and economic models that look at the different feedback loops and how damages, geographically, where are damages located, what are the economic and health impacts of various levels of climate change. These can be run with each model can be run multiple times to come up with a distribution of values. And so what's been done in this case that we'll share with you later is running these three of the main models that have been used by what's called the Intergovernmental Working Group in the US. The mean values of those models for global damages out through 2300. So these are open to, there's a fair amount of variation, a distribution curve of what the estimate of the social cost of carbon is. Typically, people are using a mean value. Sometimes people use a 95% for extreme impact value. But what we're doing today to discuss with you all is the preferences for the discount rate for social cost of carbon is to look at mean values from these multiple runs. And as you will see, the discount rate, the difference between saying, well, we think it's a 3% or a 2% discount rate or 1% has a very significant impact. Another method that has been used, people may or may not be familiar with the avoided energy supply cost study that Synapse Energy Economics has done recently for New England. It's one that's been done several times over the past decades. There's also an approach that's a marginal abatement cost that tends to be more sector specific based on a technology required to abate the last amount of carbon that is required to reach a certain target. Those are also, a marginal abatement cost method is different. So the recent Synapse study for New England put the marginal abatement cost for the electric sector as the estimated cost of offshore wind for New England. That is also very sensitive to a discount rate and can be used in sector-specific analyses, but typically what people have done with a cross-sectoral study is look at damage-based estimates. And so we're going to focus, rather than, we're going to focus on the polling exercise on damage-based estimates, and the preferences for discount rates that you all are helping us better understand how the subcommittee feels about these issues would be applied similarly to a marginal abatement cost method if that was being used in a specific subsector. So the polling exercise, what we will do right now is that Liz will post into the chat a link to the poll. And so the first thing will be if people can indicate if they're able to get to the poll, or if people have trouble, we'll give a few minutes, but just if you can open up the poll. We really would appreciate it if everybody would do this with us real time this afternoon. It's not too long. We have enough time, I think, set aside to complete it.
David, if I could ask one content question and then one polling question that I probably should have asked you before.
That's okay.
Content wise, just one question. Is there a difference between the, so the discount rate for a social cost of carbon as opposed to a discount rate for just a strict time value of money? And or should we just be thinking of those as kind of one and the same?
They're not one and the same. The time value of money depends on the perspective that you have. And as I thank you for that question. A household or an individual business might have a private discount rate, that puts greater emphasis on near-term economic costs and benefits. A social discount rate is often used more in policy or planning discussions and does tend to value future impacts more highly than an individual private or that a private discount rate. It's not that one is correct and the other is wrong, but for this exercise, even variations at the social end of the scale have significant impacts. And so to help inform the climate action plan and the economic analyses that will come out, we want to be able to give the Climate Council as well as the subcommittee members a chance to indicate their preferences and to reflect those preferences in a report that's then open for discussion and kind of helps to explain why Vermont is using a discount rate of X eventually for the primary analysis. It's not to say we can't do sensitivity analyses with higher and lower discount rates. That probably will happen. But I think it's also, Leslie Ann mentioned earlier, things need to be digestible. And if everything is open to sensitivity analyses and it's not presented clearly, this is an important factor. And so we want to get inputs on this as best we can.
Thank you. I just wanted that to be clear for folks. And I guess my next question, or maybe it's a clarification. I think The intent here is to have it be subcommittee members that are filling this poll out. And I guess I want to confirm that with subcommittee members and with you.
So if there are other, that's a good question too. I hadn't necessarily considered that. If there are other folks on the, if people want to participate in the poll, if they would, and they're not a subcommittee member, if they would just send us an email identifying themselves as that, we can let everyone participate in the poll, but we will make sure that we distinguish between the subcommittee members and the non-subcommittee members. Liz, I think when people complete the poll, we'll have an idea of the results will be anonymous. I don't know whether we actually have an identifier when we get the results from the poll. Liz,
we do not have an identifier. It's all anonymous.
Okay. Well, then Jared and TJ, sorry for not thinking that through earlier. If you would like it to be just the subcommittee members, then we should make that clear now.
That's what we had discussed in the planning meeting.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jane.
Okay.
So I think I think we have 5 subcommittee members here. So if anyone who's not a subcommittee member started filling it out, if you can either not continue. I mean, if there was a way to be able to distinguish, it would be great to have more folks fill it out. But since it's anonymous, I think we have to limit it to the 5 subcommittee members and then make available the opportunity to the 3 who aren't here today to do in the future. So I think the check will be, if there are any more than 5, then we're going to have to figure out which one was not from a subcommittee member or redo it.
Well, could we ask that right now? I'm going to send, Julie is on the call in a phone capacity, and I'm going to send her the link so she can do the poll right now. But besides that, if anybody who's a staff or public have filled it out, then we should maybe, I'm not sure how to deal with that now.
Yeah, I apologize. My intent was to have everyone that was participating in the call go ahead and do it, but I understand the issue. So yes, why don't we just ask? It'll be a smaller response. It's something that we may be able to make available through another means if we want to get other input on it. But for today, let's just have the subcommittee members actually participate in the poll, but we'll walk through the same, people can keep note of their own responses as we go through.
Yeah, I do think it would be valuable to think about that, and allow some participation separately and note that. But for today, let's keep it subcommittee members. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. So, why don't, Liz, do you, if I stop sharing and you share the screen with the poll up, I think that's probably the best way to go through the questions themselves.
Okay, can you see that?
It's coming up as on mine. There it is.
Okay, great. So we could just get started then. We're asking you to provide input to help inform the discount rate of the social cost of carbon in Vermont. David just reviewed the definitions of the social cost of carbon and the discount rate, but the definitions are here from the National Academy of Sciences paper titled Valuing Carbon Damages as a reference. And also you can click on the hyperlink if you're curious about that paper. But as a quick review, the social cost of carbon is an estimate of the value of future damages caused by 1 ton increase in carbon dioxide emissions in that year. And the discount rate is a reduction in the value that a future cost or benefit is adjusted for in each year in the future compared to the current cost or benefit. And as we'll see later in the survey, due to the power of compounding, small differences in the discount rate can have pretty large impact on an estimated social cost of carbon. So we'll start by reviewing the first two questions together. For both of them, we're asking for you to identify how strongly you agree or disagree with the statements. Both of these questions are meant to frame the discussion of a discount rate to get a general idea of a discount rate without discussing any number values right up front, and to kind of help understand the impacts of choosing a discount rate. So the first statement that we're asking you to rate is: policy and decision makers need to consider intergenerational impacts in the development of climate action plans. And we're saying impacts are both costs and benefits that occur more than 25 years in the future. So if you believe climate action plans that are written today should take into account impacts that occur 25 years or more in the future, you would select agree or strongly disagree. And if you believe that action plans should really only take into account impacts that we are seeing today or in the near term, then you would select disagree or strongly disagree. And then these two questions kind of go together, so we could review question 2 at the same time. The next statement is: we should assume that maximizing economic benefits today and in the near term accomplishes the objective of considering the best interests of future generations. So if you think that maximizing near-term economic returns is the best way to address potential future climate impacts, you would select agree or strongly disagree. Sorry, agree or strongly agree. And David, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I mean, I think that this perspective or this lens is really saying that maximizing economic benefits today does accomplish considering the best interests of future generations. So it is saying that the way that you put future generations in the best position to deal with climate impacts is to maximize net economic returns in the near term. And that with technology and the creation of wealth, you'll put future generations in a better position to deal with the issues around climate change.
So I guess let us know if you have any questions on either 1 or 2. We could give you a minute to fill it out, and then we'll move on to 3, 4, and 5.
And let me just, can I offer one thing? I don't mean, and I apologize for this, but Jared, TJ, and Jane, do you sense that I think that we can figure out a way to make sure that we have a segmented set of response from the Climate Council, the subcommittee members, perhaps by asking them to, it might require retaking it, but if we allow everyone that's on the phone today as part of the meeting to participate, I think we will get a broader response. I'm wondering how you feel about it, if there are any real concerns about that.
I guess my personal thought is it would be great for everybody to fill it out. I just know that we're going to want to be able to disaggregate that so that we can present the results of the subcommittee members separate from
right. So what we might need to do is follow up with the subcommittee members with an email and just confirm what their responses were, and then we can anonymize the rest. And so, but I would encourage us to allow everyone to fill it out today, and then we'll just have to do some follow up that we hadn't planned for, but we can do that.
David, if you're willing to stall for like 5 minutes, I can recreate the survey and have a question: are you a member of the Data and Science Subcommittee? Resend a new link, and ask people to fill that out. If that's what we want, just stall for 5 minutes and I can do it.
Go for it.
Okay.
We'll talk about whether that's a good idea or not, but yeah.
Okay.
And apologies for not thinking through that item beforehand. Kashka, your hand is up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you go over question 2 one more time? I'm
Sure.
having a little bit of tough time getting my head around it.
Okay, so it's a perspective that says when you're considering things that have future impacts, an intergenerational impact, the best way to deal with something that is going to create impacts 30 years from now is to maximize wealth creation and economic returns today, because that will make for a stronger economy that will help folks be able to develop the technology and have the resources to be able to deal with issues that maybe impacts 30 years in the future. So it's a maximizing the near-term economic impacts are more important than future economic impacts. And in part, not because future impacts aren't important, but actually creation of wealth is a way to deal with future impacts. Is that helpful, Kashka?
It is, I guess. I mean, I just feel like it's such a simple answer, but it's not an easy task to do. I mean, clearly, if that were the case, then we wouldn't have such a struggle getting the rest of the country and people on board with climate change, I would think. So, but I don't know, me thinking of it from a wrong perspective.
Yeah, I'm not advocating for one or the other here, just trying to present. These are meant to kind of bookend, and as you'll see with the next several set of questions, it's the same thing. We're trying to kind of bookend and allow folks to, again, from strongly agree to strongly disagree with those individual perspectives. Our task wasn't to come and say this is the perspective that the subcommittee should have or that the Climate Council should have, but these are important questions to think about. And there's an element of economics, there's an element of how much of a technological optimist or pessimist you are, there's ethical questions, there's intergenerational, there's a whole bunch packed into this kind of question. And so everybody will process that with their own lenses.
Okay, so we have a new survey link, including a question on whether you're a member of the subcommittee. I just sent it into the chat. So I guess I saw one person already submitted. So if you know who you are, just please take it again. And so we could get back to where we were. Does that sound good?
Yep, that does sound good. Thank you very much, Liz.
So I'll share my screen again.
Yeah. So the results will be anonymous, but you will identify whether, and we will expect to have just the 5 and 8 eventually members of the subcommittee.
So we went through the definitions. New question: are you a member of the Data and Science Subcommittee? Yes or no? Back to the strongly agree to disagree. These 2 questions we just went through. So David, do you want to start going through what is now 4, 5, and 6? Yeah,
let's give people for 2 and 3. Let's give people just a minute to complete those 2. So, some people may not feel that intergenerational impacts, costs and benefits, if you're doing it, that those future impacts, with some discount rates, future impacts become very, very small and they really aren't considered. So if you think that they definitely need 30 years plus, those impacts need to be strongly considered as you're developing it. That's what number 2 is meant. And again, number 3 is maybe somebody that thinks, no, it's more important to have economic growth and a healthy economy. And that or maximize, shouldn't use the term healthy economy, but maximize economic returns in the near term, and that is those are in the best interests of future generations. So let's go to the next one, Liz. And they're 3 different statements that are kind of 3 different positions or possible frames that people would use to consider this type of question. You'll see a little bit of kind of variation or some overlap and some repetition from the first 2 as well. But it's again trying to get the notion of how much value is placed on current impacts versus future impacts. So the first position, again, from strongly agree to strongly disagree, is kind of more of the 7 generations that policy decisions today need to be made with the impacts of 7 generations of the future in mind. So that future impacts and costs should have equal or greater weight than current impacts. The next one is, again, this similar to maximize economic growth and financial returns. Best interests of the future are served by maximizing economic growth and returns today. The responsibility of decision makers is to maximize the generation of wealth. This wealth, combined with technical advances, will put future generations in the best position to sort out, future issues. Let's go down to the next one, I think. The third statement, it's important to account for impacts on future generations, and doing so requires striking a balance between short-term economic growth and long-term impacts.
I forgot to send you information about bamboo flooring.
So those first 6 questions are all kind of intentionally kind of qualitative. And now the last couple questions start to be a little more specific in terms of framing specific dollar values. But it's helpful to have the information and to look at the information from the qualitative questions, that first set of questions, to inform the responses as well to the second ones. So for the 7th one, we're saying if there's a estimated impact of $10 million of combined economic, health, and environmental impacts that occur 30 years in the future, how much value should those be assigned in today's terms, in real terms, in 2021 dollars? So excluding the impacts of inflation, does a $10 million impact 30 years in the future, should that be valued at more than $10 million today? Is it the same? Or is there various gradations of less than $10 million?
David, is this intended to be neutral as to whether these are positive or negative impacts?
Yes.
David, can I raise something? I'm sorry, I didn't bring this up before, and I mostly intend to do it as a clarification and not to bias any results. But I think that when we talk about kind of economic impacts and how those are measured, I think I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that it's fair to say what we're talking about there is a very narrow measure of economics, such as gross domestic product or gross state product. There have been other efforts, including in Vermont, to try to account for some of the social or environmental costs or benefits or health costs or benefits in an economic framework, something like a genuine progress indicator, which Vermont had actually signed on to, and I think legally was supposed to use as its official tracking mechanism. But for purposes of this survey, we're not talking about anything beyond standard economic measurement, because that's really the issue that we're getting at, right? Is that
well, this is that's a very good clarification, Jared, and hopefully my answer will further clarify. The damage-based methodology for the integrated assessment models and the social cost of carbon is meant to estimate the health and environmental. It's not just the dollar impacts. And so those account for values of human life and the different, and it's global. And so there's a wide range, and there are a lot of uncertainties around that, but this actually is meant from the damage-based approach to be telling society that, you know, the cost for abating, the value of abating a cost of emissions now, how do we determine that? That's the social cost of carbon. And so it is not just, it's the cost of the heat pump and the savings that the heat pump generates and the fuel savings. It's the global damages from avoided sea rise and agricultural output impacts and health impacts and all of these things.
That makes perfect sense when we're talking about what the social cost of carbon is aiming to do. And so I should have brought this up earlier, not in so much in the context of question 7, but more in those kind of, you know, rough statements of your view in terms of what we're talking about in the economy. Like that question 2 was, you're assuming that, or the statement there is, if we have economic growth, and that's as traditionally measured, is the proponents of that perspective, I think, are thinking of that in terms of GDP, not in terms of progress.
The social cost of carbon is meant to capture this broad set of damage-based impacts. And then the discount rate that you apply to that could be from a more private firm economic, maximize economic growth benefit method, or no, a discount rate needs to be explicitly designed to protect and or consider the future generations. So the discount rate itself applies to the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon and the damage-based is meant to be this broader, not just the dollars and cents from the measures and mitigation, but the entire package. So hopefully that's clarifying. Are we good to go on to the last question? And I didn't say earlier, we will take feedback and comments too on this. You know, we recognize we're running a poll here with you all. We will welcome kind of comments on the poll, the structure of the poll, et cetera, as feedback after this session. And we can reflect those in either the further polling of the entire Climate Council or in our reporting and stuff. Now here, one way to have done this whole exercise would be to put up a table like the table that we see in this question and say which is the proper discount rate to use. But what we wanted to do were have these framing questions and perspectives before that, because I think that it's informative to see that. And then also this table clearly indicates this is done again based on hundreds of runs of the 3 integrated assessment models, the mean values. It's been adopted by New York State, and the discount rate, you can see the impact that the discount rate has on the social cost of carbon. So if at 3%, your range is from $51 a ton in 2020 to $85 in 2050. At 2%, it's more than twice that amount. And then at 1%, again, it's almost then, it's again more than twice that amount. And 0%, this is a model that goes out through 2300. 0% is saying that you are not discounting the future impacts, even the ones that are out in 2300 at all, and you're accounting for all of them. And so 0% discount rate takes into account all of the future estimated damages without any discounting. So the question on this one is which, based on, if you were given this table, based on those values, what discount rate would you recommend for Vermont with regard specifically to for use of the social cost of carbon in the climate action plan?
David, I'm really struggling with this, and I've never understood discount rates very well. Can we go back to the previous question for a moment?
Sure.
This one. So can I paraphrase this? Can I say, if I want $10 million worth of benefits 30 years from now, I'm willing to spend $9 million now or $5 million now? Is that a good paraphrase?
You could say if you, for $10 million worth of benefits 30 years in the future, yes. Or to avoid $10 million worth of damages 30 years in the future, how much would you be willing to pay today to avoid those?
Okay.
And Richard, an important element of that is that it's not you, it's not you and then you 30 years in the future. It is, again, from a policy and decision-making perspective, if a decision maker for Vermont is avoiding $10 million of damages 30 years in the future, or is getting $10 million worth of benefits 30 years in the future, how much is that worth today? But it's not for the individual, it's for Vermont's economy. It's for the beneficiaries of the decision-making in this process.
Part of what I'm trying to figure out here is that in the physical world, the greenhouse gases that we emit are cumulative.
Yeah.
To a first approximation, every bit of CO2 that we put out now will still be here 30 years from now.
Yes.
As will the stuff that we put out next year and the stuff that we put out the year after that. So that it's cumulative.
So the emissions, the estimates in the next table down are based on a range of concentration, a range of emissions. And they are based, you could do one that is strictly, you could say, if the rest of the globe makes no progress and emissions keep going business as usual, the damages will be much higher. If progress is being made, emissions come down. These represent multiple runs of all of those models to try to come up with a mean value, so that rather than not having a value in the decision-making process, we have something that is representative of, given the best modeling that we're able to do and the various mitigation pathways that represent both progress, lack of progress, technical advances, lack of technical advances. These are mean values of what the value of that cumulative emissions is. So it is the geophysical models and the integrated assessment models capture, I think, what you're talking about. After you've done that, you still come back to the question of, and I recognize this is a difficult exercise to engage in, because we're being asked to make it's a it's a multifaceted kind of decision that touches on economics, kind of their ethical questions and policy questions too, about what are the proper values here. But the
So-
geophysical part of the emissions, the cumulative impacts of emissions and those damages are meant to be represented by the values in the,
Well, it
in the
seems like
table.
those percentages are something different from what we're, I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble with this, but let me,
That's okay. I mean, I think,
again, if I, not only is the damage cumulative, but the impact of the preventive measures that I take is also cumulative. So if I make an intervention now that reduces greenhouse gas emissions today, this year, the impact of that is felt in a cumulative way forever, basically, for as long as CO2 lasts in the atmosphere. And
again, intent, yes, we started with qualitative discussion of the issue, and then the numbers that we've provided are based on modeling that is actually several different models for capturing the residency time, the other emissions from other jurisdictions, different concentration levels and different levels of sea rise, and these things are meant to be represented by these values.
yeah, I'm just going to tell you right now that I'm not going to answer that question,
Okay,
question 8, or whatever it is,
okay,
because
fair enough.
there are too many black boxes, and I don't get it.
Okay. Well, again, we welcome feedback on this, and if there are ways without, the hard part is to take all of the literature and the scientific work and the tools that are out there, but then make it into something that's digestible and, represents the fact that there are levels of uncertainty and ranges. We could present different distribution functions of the damages, and these represent the mean values, but maybe there are ways that we can make it a little more digestible for folks.
Also, I don't see a place to answer question 8 on my screen.
It's down below. I think you have to click the,
Oh, there we go. It's below the OK button.
yeah,
Thank you.
sorry.
All right.
Sorry. So let me see, are there other questions right now? Kashka, yes?
I'm so sorry, David.
That's fine.
I'm kind of
I'm not sure if I'm hearing you.
this to skew the survey.
I'm sorry, Kashka, I didn't hear anything except the last word survey.
Oh gosh. I said I wouldn't want my inability to understand this to skew the survey. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Well, in that case, we can follow up with you and recognize that it may not have been laid out in a way that is easy for you to understand. But so feel free to reply if you can. But if there are clarifying questions and again feedback that I've got a couple last slides that talk about how we will next steps and how we can use the information. So, but if you want to follow up individually with us, we can discuss further. And if that helps you be able to feel like you're able to answer the survey, we can do that.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so that's the last question on the survey. Liz, why don't I share my screen again? Thank you for doing that.
Sure. It looks like Jared has his hand up.
I was just going to offer that, it may be helpful to explicitly state this, because I think it's totally natural that this is complex and complicated, and that this is one measure expressed in economic terms of trying to summarize things that we often don't think of as just an economic issue. I think sometimes people are more familiar or comfortable in ethical or moral frameworks, and it's not always intuitive to reduce the impact of, health impacts, or the decrease in life expectancy, or the value of a human life to a dollar cost. And this relates to that in some ways. And so I would just say that I think it's natural to if you're used to working in different frameworks around moral and ethical considerations versus just reducing things to dollars and cents, that this may feel a little awkward, but I think that it is one measure, one piece of analysis that helps us be able to make sure that some of those considerations, beyond just the straight dollars and cost in a financial sense, but more in terms of some of the ethical considerations around social and environmental costs and benefits, actually do end up getting incorporated, especially as it relates to future generations. So I just wanted to flag that I think it's natural for there to be some confusion or discomfort that arises in these type of conversations.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And we don't, these are useful inputs. They don't necessarily, there's no, in the end, there really is not a single correct answer for these questions, but I think that the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan will benefit from being informed by this type of, hopefully we use the poll in a way that provides some results that we can reflect on, and they can be the basis for recommendations about the primary and the sensitivity, perhaps discount rates that would be used in the analysis. And the economic analysis of the mitigation scenarios will be impacted by the choice of the social cost of carbon discount rate. And that it shouldn't just be a footnote. It should have had some discussion and informed engagement from members of this committee and others from the public. So we appreciate your patience and working through this with us today. And I put up my email and Liz's email. You can send us comments or questions, and if you would like to clarify some of the questions that it raised for you further, we're happy to do that. We'll include the results from the poll and the social cost of carbon report, and then the full Climate Council would take the same or a revised poll, if there are ways that we can revise this in August to inform the economic analysis of the Climate Action Plan. So thank you very much for allowing us the time to work through this with everybody today.
I do have an energy economist in my family whom some of you know, and I'm going to ask him to give me a tutorial. Maybe I can answer the questions later.
Okay.
Thank you, David and Liz, for walking us through this exercise and the update. I apologize if I missed it in the last couple of minutes, but did you talk about the timing of the report? Is that on the same timeline as the greenhouse gas inventory?
We're working to try to get both of them done by, at one point we were, and I'm glad we didn't, I think we had a good discussion, TJ and Jared and Jane and I last week, that this was complicated enough. We were potentially thinking of doing this polling without being able to guide folks through it. And I think that clearly would not have worked. So yes, we're working roughly on the same time schedule. We're trying to get both of these reports and their drafts done this coming week, and be able to provide that for review and comments back from folks. That first week in August, probably.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, thank you again, and thank you for the good discussion and questions. And I emphasize what Jared said earlier, and this is really complicated. And I'll just add, even if you are used to dealing with discount rates, I talk myself in circles with it. I did with David on a different issue yesterday, actually. So thank you very much. One other note, I guess I just kind of wrapped into this task group with the social cost of carbon is the evaluation of the department's model that we've or workbook, I guess, that we've put out for the last couple of years with the annual energy report, estimating the carbon, the cost for carbon reductions from different mitigation measures. And I just want to note that EFG is also reviewing that along with thinking about how other states do and a kind of a supply curve of mitigation options. And so that's, I just say that to remind folks that effort is ongoing too. The discount rate plays a role in that conversation as well when you bring things back to, to just be comparable on things that have different lifetimes of value, to bring it back to a single year of present value to be comparable. And so discount rate comes into play all over the place. And I think, to the extent we can elevate folks' understanding of it, including myself, it's really valuable. So I think right now we will open the floor to public comment. And thank you all for bearing with us. I know we're running past 3 o'clock here. Steve.
Am I okay? There we go. Hi, thanks. This has been really interesting. Thanks for all your work on this today. I have a couple of comments that I'd like to make. One about the concept of the life cycle costing and the inventory and reporting, and second about the survey. So about the regarding greenhouse gases and accounting. I think I heard the idea that you need to be restricted to the kinds of inventory assessment that can be reported as required to various outside agencies outside the state. And I guess I find that to be just missing some important pieces. The parallel I often think of is my taxes. When I'm doing my taxes, I have my database of everything I've done all year, and then I have both the state and the feds coming after me for money. They're asking different questions. They are getting different answers, and they do different kinds of analysis. But it's not cheating for me to give one set of answers to the feds and another set of answers to the state. They're asking different questions. So I have a hard time thinking that Vermont can only come up with one kind of report of our greenhouse gases. If our law is requiring us to include the out-of-state emissions that result from in-state energy use, and the EPA or IPCC wants something else, that's okay. We can do both. And I think we should, because the way the law says that we should account for those energy impacts in the pipeline, so to speak, really reflects our impacts. And if we change our behavior, we change those impacts. So that's what we want to do. That's what we need. And I think that's what should happen here. And it has a considerable bearing on how you make decisions and deployment of ideas in the future. So I think that's pretty important. So secondly, this is a really interesting exercise to go through this discount rate business. I think it's one of those fundamental value questions that people struggle with. And I think often people who are in decision-making roles sort of have to imagine, what's best for their state or their country or something. But when I think of how the Climate Council has been setting itself up, and particularly with relation to the questions about equity and the guidance the council's getting from the Just Transitions Committee and the Matrix and all that everybody's done, there's a huge emphasis on making sure that the voices of all, including the unrepresented or underrepresented, the voices of all are included in these fundamental value questions. I think that the inaccessibility of these concepts to people who are on this call would be even greater going out to the broader public. But I think it's important to try to figure that out, because this is one of those fundamental value questions. It actually doesn't get much more fundamental than this in terms of how we plan for the future. And so to me, it seems really important to go not beyond this call. I appreciate being able to contribute in the survey, but beyond the Climate Council members and into that broader public that we're trying to reach out to and engage somehow. And I think it has to be somewhat different format than the survey, but I'm not sure how to do that. But it seems like that's one of the things that, it's so fundamental in terms of values, that assuming that the decision makers can make the judgments for the broader public is almost exactly what we're trying not to do. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I think some of those policy trade-off questions and framing those up. I mean, this is one of them, and that the discount rate is representing. I think that's a really a good point, and that we'll have to think about how to really get to the meat of that in the public engagement in a way that's accessible. So Rob, I saw your hand go up next.
Yes, I just wanted to, I made a comment in the chat that at this point, I think the near term has become extremely critical. And if we don't start to bend the curve very rapidly, we will get into feedback loops that make future planning impossible. I think we may have already reached that point. Things are getting very tense all over the world. But I did want to comment that a lot of corporations are accounting for capital for carbon internally, and there is sort of a cluster of companies. Point out Swiss Re in particular, a big financial organization, has set its internal rate of carbon at this point at $100 per ton. A metric ton, and it expects that to rise to about $200 a ton in the near future. Carbon removal is available, and we should keep in mind that there are some technologies which will not be able to be reduced to net zero or anything approaching that in the near future. I point out, for example, aviation. And there are technologies which are being pushed as efficiency measures, which in fact are sort of a Trojan horse for additional emissions. And to that, I specifically point to heat pumps, which contain refrigerants, which are very, very strong greenhouse gas emissions contributors. And this is a very interesting exercise, but the availability of immediate carbon removal is something that needs to be examined. It's being certainly at a federal level. There's a great deal of energy and attention and money going into carbon removal at this point. But this has not been a topic for the Climate Council. And don't know why, other than it just hasn't come up, and there's no expertise native to the committee on that particular subject. But the rest of the world has got it, and it's available. It's for sale, and it's about $100 a ton. And if you could do better pulling it out of the atmosphere today than later, that is certainly something to consider.
Thank you, Rob. Certainly relevant in both the time value discussion and what David touched upon earlier with the marginal abatement cost, which you referenced that Synapse study and previous iterations of that study, used $100 a ton of carbon and based on carbon capture and sequestration. So I think that's very relevant. Thank you. So Annette, you are next on my list.
I think George raised his hand first, so why don't you hear from him first?
Oh, okay. Sorry, George. I saw the first two and then didn't see the order after that. Go ahead, George.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate in a poll. It was a thought-provoking perspective. I've read the National Academy of Sciences Societal Cost report from 2017, or at least the executive summary part of it. And I have a concern about the way this is being approached. There's a fundamental physical phenomenon we have to deal with in the climate system, and that is there is a red line beyond which the feedback loops become self-reinforcing and they spin out of control exponentially. This is something that is got many different estimates for how much budget we have left, but nonetheless, it's a kind of a red line that's in the future, not too far out, within the next few decades. And the consequence of that is setting a societal cost is more about how do you avoid crossing the red line than it is about any of the other economic metrics that one might imagine putting in play here. So at least in terms of societal costs, whatever the discount rate needs to be to force society to get zero emissions before we hit the red line, which if I believe the special report 15 that was published in 2018 by the IPCC, we have basically this decade to get most of that done, and certainly most of the remaining decade to 2040 to get everybody down to near zero. And they got some slack in that, I guess, but it's not really, 2050 is what everyone's been targeting. But given all the trend lines, I'm convinced that's not, it might be a bit dangerous. We actually might have the goalpost moved on us. And so that's kind of my feedback on this exercise about societal cost. I also mentioned in the chat that there's societal cost associated with both methane and carbon dioxide. As you may be aware, methane has extensive gradient forcing in its short lifetime. And if it pushes us over that red line, it doesn't matter whether we cut our emissions later to zero. We're already over the edge. So that's kind of a big incentive to add a societal cost for methane that reflects that that factor. And I don't know that any of the integrated assessment models that are being used for societal cost have that type of logic programmed into them. They're kind of the models are fairly complex. They have a lot of uncertainty in them, and unfortunately, what gets lost in there is some of the climate science models are arguably less accurate than others. And our society has a bias towards economic outcomes that are favorable. And in this scenario we're currently in, that may not be the only, that may be not necessarily path that leads to success in the long term. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Just briefly, George, there are estimates for the social cost of methane and nitrous oxide from the work that we cited in New York. I was worried that, and the discount rate, you know, the value of those gases is higher. The discount rate, the application of a discount rate for carbon dioxide, I don't think you'd necessarily have different discount rates for different gases. But the damage associated with those is estimated in some of the modeling that's been done to support the New York DEC work. But thank you for those comments.
All right, third time's a charm. Thank you, George. Annette, I think you are up now.
Thank you. I wanted to appreciate Richard Hawkins' discussion about assessment of health effects, and and something in the presentation also brings to mind the question of what's included in health impacts. A lot of my work involves the effects of environmental issues on people's health, and it's often discounted. I will use one energy example, and that's the health effects from industrial wind turbines. And the industry adamantly refuses to acknowledge their impacts, while in Vermont, we've had people abandon their homes, get very sick from the health effects. So how does that get included? I work on radio frequency, electromagnetic frequency, where the reason the Vermonters work in these environments, the reason there's an opt-out on smart meters, because some people can't live with them. They make them sick. There is not a generally recognized acknowledgement of that in the traditional health regulators. So that's another aspect of this, that, you know, the idea of more smart appliances and things, does that sort of effect get included in an accounting like this? I've similarly had water disinfection chemicals that are causing some people to get sick. So it's a problem in terms of what one considers with the health effects. And I have a lot of on-the-ground experience with it, and I am really disappointed. I just learned that the Just Transitions group held their stakeholder meeting, and they did their interviews, and I fully expected to be included, and I wasn't. And so that ship has sailed, leaving me with the only opportunity to bring my real world on the ground perspective to this whole effort to the legislature after you issue your report. And I just, you know, I'm in a unique position, and I thought that my experience would be considered. So I'm bringing this to you and the Science and Data Committee as part of your accounting for what's actually happening in Vermont and what may happen in Vermont. And I found this whole presentation, as I've said before, I'm not an abstract thinker. I found it quite challenging. I don't know how I would put a percentage rate on the discount, but I did find that the public discount rate and the private discount rate, I mean, so much of my work involves impacts to minorities. And I don't mean necessarily the BIPOC population. I mean people who are in the minority compared to everything else. And so what we have been doing in Vermont is establishing a policy of sacrificing people. And those are my people. And I have had to tell more people, I think you just have to move. And I don't want to have to keep doing that. I run up against housing problems all the time because people don't have the resources to move away from things that are causing them harm. So thank you. Those are my comments.
TJ, could I just take a minute to respond to the public engagement component?
Yeah, please do.
Thanks, Annette, for your comment. And just speaking to where we're at with the engagement for the public engagement plan, the initial interviews and roundtables that were held were in no way intended to be in engagement. They were intended to be a representative group component of the population to get at the question of how we do engagement as we move into this next phase. So it wasn't a question, it wasn't sort of testing the work of the Climate Council or the Climate Action Plan development. It was really about how do we speak to engagement in the public engagement plan and develop strategies for this next phase as we roll the public engagement plan out and begin to implement that, at which point there will be many more opportunities for one-on-one conversations to inform the climate action plan development. And so the public engagement plan is just that right now as a draft. We met with the consultants just before this meeting actually around how we will roll that out for both council and subcommittee comments as well as public review. And that will be, there's comments being submitted right now by A&R staff who manage the contract with Climate Access and RISE who are handling that. Those comments will be back in by Friday. And then we expect next Wednesday a fully formatted draft public engagement plan with a survey targeting specific questions to the council and subcommittees to be rolled out for comment. And then the real targeted engagement in the development phase of the climate action plan will be starting in earnest. Well, it'll start in August and then will really be in earnest during the month of September. And so I hope that you don't feel like you've missed your opportunity. And I know that there'll be many more opportunities to reach out to folks like you and others who have a concerted interest in this planning effort. So thank you for that.
Well, I will say that I do have unique expertise that should have been used to inform how one goes about engaging with the public. And to have been left out of that, you can look at the comment that I sent to the Just Transitions Committee. It reduces the credibility of the whole effort, in my view. And I'm not placing an elevated, view of what my work, but 20 years of engaging with the public on energy and environment issues is something that should have been tapped, and it wasn't. So I just wanted to say that and be done.
Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you for all the public comment and all the participation in the survey and the discussion today. As far as next steps, we have in 2 weeks. It sounds like we're likely to have then the reports on social cost of carbon and greenhouse gas inventory, at least initial review or discussion. We'll firm that up as it gets closer, and also that's probably the time frame for a further update from the LEAP modeling as well. Those 3 things are probably too big of an agenda for one meeting, even one that goes till 4. But we'll sort out what the agenda is and go from there. I'm thinking, and this is off the cuff here, but based on some brief conversation Jared and I had before the call, that if you agree, Jared, next week we could probably cancel the meeting.
Yeah, I think most of the next set of items we're really going to need to focus on and review and discuss together. I don't think we'll be ready by next week. So unless somebody has a different agenda item that they feel is pressing, that sounds appropriate to me to focus more of the next meetings on August 4th and August 11th.
I guess that just while David's here, I thought those reports were due to be final by the end of July. And so if there was a chance for feedback on the greenhouse gas inventory, is that too late by the subcommittee? Maybe I'm off myself in my understanding of next steps, but I thought next week was the time for feedback from the subcommittee on the greenhouse gas inventory.
Yes, but we don't have them fully completed to be able to be ready for review yet. So, I mean, just there are so many pieces, you know, that we're working on in parallel. So depending on, and I, while we were here, I saw some requests for internal review as well. I don't see an opportunity to be able to give people drafts, get feedback, and have them final next week. That's just not, that's too much for right now. So we will work to have, then we just need to talk about what the sequencing of review and comments back is to be most efficient on that.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Once again, thank you all. I know we scheduled it to end at 3, but the discussion was robust enough and I think really valuable. So thank you all for staying with us. I enjoy the rest of your afternoon and week. We will see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.